Hey guys! Tonight, we're opening a specific, dusty corner of the archives to look at medieval emergency fixes. I'm talking about the kind of inventions born at 3 o'clock in the morning while a city was actively burning and the people were coughing in the dark. These weren't grand visions of progress, they were frantic responses to the brink of collapse. So, before you get fully comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely find value in the journeys we take here. And please, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always deeply fascinating to see who is joining our circle from around the world in these quiet hours. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Quarantine was not a gift to humanity from doctors, or scientists, or anyone wearing a reassuring white coat. In reality, it was invented by exhausted medieval officials who were staring at city squares full of corpses and realizing, with a cold chill, that something was clearly happening. They had no microscopes to consult and no medical textbooks to offer a cure, there was only a horrifying, repeating pattern and a bone-deep desire to stop digging graves. The port cities of the medieval world were the first to witness the rhythm of death. A ship would arrive from a distant land, and at first, the atmosphere was electric. Trade resumed, silks and spices were offloaded, and the economy hummed. But then, within days, the lungs of the citizens would begin to fail. People started coughing in a way that suggested, with grim certainty, that this was not going to end well. Bells began to toll, streets emptied as families hid behind locked doors, and inevitably, someone in a darkened room pointed a finger and said, "This didn't happen before that ship showed up." And just like that, humanity stumbled into the science of epidemiology entirely by accident. The medieval solution was simple, brutal, and deeply characteristic of the age, they simply decided to delay everything. Ships were no longer welcomed with open arms, instead, they were ordered to sit offshore in the freezing salt air and essentially think about what they had done. Travelers were kept outside the massive stone city walls, treated like socially awkward guests who had arrived far too early for a party no one wanted to host. Goods were left untouched on the docks, as if the disease possessed a sense of personal space and merely needed 40 days to calm down and go away. That famous 40-day waiting period, the quarantina, wasn't a sacred number derived from a laboratory. It wasn't based on peer-reviewed data. It was simply a duration deemed long enough for someone to start looking suspiciously unwell. If the crew stayed alive and no one developed the telltale fever after 40 days, then congratulations. You were probably safe. If someone did die during that window, well, the problem often solved itself before any official paperwork became necessary. Being placed in quarantine was a unique brand of medieval misery. You weren't necessarily sick, but you certainly weren't trusted. You existed in a purgatory of suspicion. Food was delivered to you at arm's length, pushed toward you with long poles or left on doorsteps like a peace offering to a ghost. Guards watched your every move as if you were a walking mistake waiting to happen. Conversations in this period happened across wide, open spaces, shouted loudly enough for your voice to echo back to you, tinged with the palpable fear of the person listening. Imagine the psychological toll, being lonely, bored, and painfully aware that everyone in the city secretly hoped you would either recover with impossible speed or simply exit history quietly without making a scene. Inside the city walls, the act of quarantine created the necessary illusion of control. People desperately wanted to believe that stone walls and long waiting periods could protect them from the invisible. It was a comforting lie even when it wasn't entirely true. But, every so often, it actually worked. Fewer people died. The panic began to slow its pulse. Order returned just enough for society to pretend that things were back under control. And here is the most important part of the story. It worked often enough to be remembered. Quarantine stopped being a frantic, desperate emergency measure and slowly, century by century, it hardened into policy. Observation turned into tradition, and tradition eventually hardened into law. What began as a panicked medieval improvisation became the sturdy backbone of modern public health. Today, the word quarantine sounds clinical, responsible, and organized. Back then, it was much closer to a guard pointing a spear and saying, *stand over there and don't touch anything, we'll see what happens. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't kind, but it was effective enough to survive for 800 years. Bureaucracy wasn't invented because medieval rulers had a deep-seated love for forms, leather folders, or the quiet joy of alphabetical order. It was invented because, during a crisis, everyone started shouting at once and absolutely nothing worked. When the drums of war broke out, when the harvests failed, or when plagues emptied entire villages, medieval governments faced a terrifying, existential realization: if nothing was written down, reality itself became optional. In the early days of these crises, rulers relied on nothing but memory and verbal commands. This went about as well as you might expect. Who owed taxes to the crown? No one seemed to remember. Who had already paid their dues? That was also remarkably unclear. Who owned which plot of land now that half the village had either fled into the woods or died in their beds? That was the most excellent question of all. Arguments multiplied faster than rabbits with ambition. To survive, officials reached for the most powerful and transformative tool available to the human hand: ink. Lists began to appear in flickering candlelight. Ledgers were painstakingly created. Names were recorded with trembling hands. Properties were described in exhausting, mundane detail. Suddenly, the very act of survival required paperwork. This wasn't administration for the sake of efficiency or big government. It was raw, unadulterated damage control. When society started unraveling at the seams, writing things down was the only way to keep the world from completely melting into a puddle of chaos. Census records emerged not because those ancient rulers cared deeply about demographics or population trends, but because they needed to know, for the sake of the kingdom's survival, exactly who was still alive and who was still capable of holding a plow or a sword. Tax rolls in the medieval world were never about social fairness, equity, or the common good. They were a cold, calculated mechanism of survival. A way to ensure that someone, anyone at all, was still left alive to fund the kingdom's defense and keep the gears of the state from grinding to a halt. When the world felt like it was ending, the crown didn't care about your story, it cared about your coin. During these eras of mass panic, court records multiplied at a staggering rate. Officials realized very quickly that relying on human witnesses was a recipe for disaster. You see, history shows us a consistent, uncomfortable truth. Frightened people lie, they misremember out of terror, they shift blame to save their necks, and they succumb to the haze of trauma. In this landscape of uncertainty, the medieval clerk, or clerk as they were often known, emerged as a quiet, unsung emergency worker. While the knights fought bloody, losing battles on the front lines and the early doctors failed heroically in the plague wards, the clerk remained in the shadows. He sat hunched over a scarred wooden desk, documenting the fleeting shreds of reality so they didn't disappear into the fog. These men preserved the very structure of civilization with ink-stained fingers and a deep, simmering resentment toward anyone who dared to ask, can't you just remember? Memory is a ghost, but ink is a witness. Humanity, quite predictably, hated bureaucracy almost immediately. From the very first ledger, the forms were confusing, the rules felt entirely arbitrary, and the officials were agonizingly slow. In that regard, you could argue that nothing has truly changed in 1,000 years. But bureaucracy possessed one unbeatable, secret advantage: it worked when everything else stopped working. Once the immediate fires were extinguished and the emergencies passed, the mountains of paperwork didn't simply vanish into the night. The records proved to be too useful to discard. Written agreements reduced the number of endless family feuds. Detailed lists prevented the expensive duplication of efforts. Slowly, and with immense reluctance, the temporary bureaucracy became a permanent fixture of human life. What began as a form of frantic, medieval panic management evolved into the massive machine of modern administration. Every permit you sign today, every license in your wallet, every complex application, and every sterile government form traces its direct lineage back to a time when rulers realized a hard truth. Yelling orders into a crowd of terrified people produces nothing but louder yelling. So, the next time you're frustrated by red tape, remember, yes, bureaucracy is annoying. Yes, it often feels entirely pointless. But it exists because our ancestors learned that absolute chaos is far, far worse. And somewhere in the distant past, a tired clerk simply nodded to himself, dipped his quill, and kept on writing. Before these grand emergencies forced humanity to cooperate, time in the medieval world was nothing more than a suggestion. It was a flexible concept, a personal opinion, a loose agreement between neighbors that shifted with the weather. Noon happened whenever the sun felt like it was roughly overhead, and everyone politely agreed not to ask any further questions. This worked perfectly well for a rural, slow-moving world, until the moment something urgent happened and people actually needed to show up at the exact same second. When cities were suddenly faced with coordinated siege attacks, raging fires, mandatory curfews, or desperate food shortages, this vague approach to timekeeping became a lethal liability. A command to meet at dawn was utterly useless if dawn meant 3 different things to 3 different captains across the city. Bells rang early. Bells rang late. Sometimes, bells rang whenever the bell ringer simply felt like pulling the rope. Chaos followed. Sometimes it was literal, bloody chaos. Other times, it was just a staggering amount of unproductive yelling in the dark. To solve this, medieval cities did something truly revolutionary. They standardized time. This move wasn't born out of scientific curiosity or a passion for celestial mechanics, it was born out of sheer, unadulterated frustration. If the city was going to defend its gates, pray as a single body, or distribute dwindling food supplies without a riot, everyone needed to agree on the exact moment those things occurred. Church bells became the audible backbone of this new, synchronized reality. Fixed hours were established with religious rigidity. Bells began to ring at set, unmoving intervals that ignored the feelings of the ringer. If you missed the bell, that was now considered your personal failure, not a fault of the sun. Eventually, the mechanical clock followed, massive, clanking, wildly expensive machines of brass and iron. They were often inaccurate by modern standards, but they did one thing better than nature itself: they were consistent. In the heart of an emergency, consistency was everything. Standardized time allowed the city guards to change their shifts with military reliability. Markets could open and close on a predictable schedule that prevented hoarding. Curfews could finally be enforced without long, circular arguments about the length of shadows on a cobblestone wall. For the first time in history, a coordinated human response became a reality. People still complained, of course, human beings always do, but now, they had the courtesy to complain on time. Naturally, no one liked this new regime at first. Standardized time felt intrusive, cold, and robotic. People deeply resented being told exactly when they were required to wake, when they had to work, when they were allowed to eat, and when they were forced to sleep. It felt unnatural, because it was. For millennia, medieval life had flowed with the gentle, seasonal rhythm of daylight. Now, they were being strapped to the gears of a machine that never slept. In the ancient world, life possessed a gentle, organic pulse. It flowed with the rising sun and the shifting seasons, not with the jarring sound of bronze bells screaming instructions at you from a stone tower. But once this time discipline was adopted, it never truly left our collective DNA. It was simply too useful to discard. Cities began to function like singular organisms. Authority became infinitely easier to enforce when everyone lived by the same rhythm. Most importantly, emergencies, those moments where seconds mean the difference between life and death, became manageable instead of frantic. Fast forward a few centuries, and here we are, the descendants of that transition. We schedule every waking moment of our existence. We have reached a point where we measure human productivity by the minute. We feel a cold, modern spike of panic the moment our phone battery dies, not just because we lose our connection to the world, but because suddenly, time becomes ambiguous again. And ambiguity makes the modern mind deeply uncomfortable. All of this exists because medieval people, standing amidst chaos, once said, "We need everyone to show up now, not roughly later." Standardized time didn't necessarily make life better or happier, but it made life controllable. And in the face of an emergency, control always wins the day. Medieval cities did not invent the concept of street cleaning because the ruling elite cared about urban beauty, physical comfort, or the emotional well-being of the pedestrians passing through. They didn't care about aesthetics. They invented it because, in the 14th century, the street smelled like a warning sign. When a great mortality arrived, filth had almost always arrived first. And when that filth was allowed to linger, death followed close behind like an unwanted companion who refused to leave the room. For the majority of the Middle Ages, the streets were chaotic, multi-purpose arenas. People walked there, worked their trades there, and very enthusiastically dumped their waste there. Household trash, animal droppings, butcher scraps, and whatever else needed to disappear were all generously contributed to the public thoroughfare. Rain was the only planned sanitation system. It was expected to deal with the mountain of refuse eventually. However, the rain did not always cooperate. Then came the devastating outbreaks, and suddenly, city officials noticed something curious and terrifying. The neighborhoods drowning in waste were almost always the exact same neighborhoods filling up the local graveyards. No one understood the secret life of bacteria or the biology of a virus, but medieval people were excellent at noticing patterns when the consequences were severe enough to wipe out entire families. In response, cities pivoted toward what passed for emergency hygiene. It was a crude, desperate shift in behavior. Harsh orders were issued from the town halls. Residents were commanded to clear their refuse immediately or face the wrath of the law. Gutters were dug into the earth with a frantic, newfound energy. Waste was pushed away from living areas and toward rivers, stagnant pits, or the edges of town, which, to be fair, usually just moved the problem to someone else's doorstep. But at the very least, it wasn't here anymore. This was not polite sanitation as we know it today. This was aggressive cleanliness fueled entirely by the cold hand of fear. Heavy fines were imposed for dumping waste improperly. Entire streets were ordered to clean themselves all at once, an event that was far less coordinated than it sounds and usually involved a staggering amount of shouting and finger-pointing. People complained loudly about the inconvenience of these new rules, which is strangely comforting. It proves that nothing about basic human nature has truly changed in 1,000 years. But the street cleaning worked. It worked just well enough to change the world. Areas that successfully removed their waste saw fewer outbreaks. The overpowering, sickly smell of rot began to lessen. The insects retreated. People stopped dying quite so fast. And once a practice reduces the death rate, even by a slight margin, it tends to stick around. Over time, these emergency cleanups transformed into a routine. Cities eventually began to hire dedicated workers specifically to remove waste. Temporary panic rules became permanent laws. Infrastructure followed the policy, and simple dirt gutters eventually evolved into complex, subterranean sewers. What began as medieval officials shouting, "Get rid of that before we all perish," slowly and quietly evolved into the sophisticated modern sanitation systems we rely on today. In our modern world, we associate clean streets with order, civic pride, and safety. But back then, cleanliness wasn't about pride, it was about raw survival. A foul-smelling street wasn't just an unpleasant sensory experience, it was a biological signal that something much worse was coming for you. Medieval street cleaning wasn't about making cities nice. It was about making them less deadly. Every time you walk down a clean, paved sidewalk today, you are the direct beneficiary of medieval people learning the hard way that rot and civilization cannot share the same space for long. Medieval cities learned about the lethal danger of fire in the exact same way people learn not to touch a hot stove. By touching it repeatedly, losing everything, and then acting genuinely surprised when the world caught fire again. Consider the volatile ingredients of a medieval city: bone-dry wood, flammable thatch roofs, narrow streets that acted as natural chimneys, open flames in every single room, and a constant, swirling wind. Together, these elements formed a perfect, lethal partnership dedicated to total urban destruction. In this era, a single stray spark could erase an entire neighborhood in a single afternoon. One careless hearth left unattended for a moment, one overturned candle in a dark bedroom, or one baker getting a little too ambitious with the heat of his oven, that was all it took to change the course of history forever. A single spark was a death sentence for a city. One careless hearth, one single overturned candle, or one bakery getting a little too ambitious with its oven, that was all it took. And suddenly, the city was on fire in a way that felt personal. These weren't slow, creeping blazes. The flames jumped from roof to roof like they had a schedule to keep and an empire to dismantle. In those moments, people didn't evacuate with the calm, orderly precision of a modern drill. They ran, they screamed, and they desperately tried to save household items that, in the cold light of hindsight, were deeply replaceable. After rebuilding the same cities for the third or fourth time, medieval authorities finally reached a revolutionary, albeit painful, conclusion: maybe this keeps happening for a reason. What followed were frantic emergency rules. Thatched roofs, those beautiful but lethal fire traps, were banned in high-density areas. The use of stone and tile was encouraged, or more often, forcibly required by law. Buildings were ordered to be spaced apart. Not for aesthetics or curb appeal, but to give fires fewer opportunities to socialize and spread their destruction. Hearths were regulated. Chimneys were inspected with a newfound rigor. Open flames, once a private domestic matter, were suddenly everyone's business. These weren't thoughtful, visionary urban reforms, they were raw trauma responses. Predictably, people hated the new rules. Stone was expensive to quarry. Tile was heavy and difficult to install. Spacing buildings apart meant landowners had to give up valuable, profitable land. Artisans complained, and landowners complained even louder. Everyone complained, until the next great fire arrived and reminded them exactly why the rules existed in the first place. Fire codes worked, not perfectly, and certainly not overnight, but they worked noticeably. Fires still happened, of course, but they no longer consumed entire cities with the same voracious enthusiasm. Neighborhoods survived. Insurance systems eventually emerged from the wreckage. Rebuilding became a manageable task instead of a constant, life-defining cycle. And once again, the emergency fix stayed. Every modern fire code, every high-tech sprinkler system, every fire-rated building material, every spacing regulation, and every mandatory inspection traces its lineage back to those medieval officials trying to stop their cities from reenacting the same disaster every single generation. The language changed and the enforcement improved, but the frustration remained. We now think of fire safety as simple common sense, but medieval people thought of it as an annoying interference, until everything they owned burned down again. Fire codes didn't make medieval cities safe, they made them survivable. And every time a building inspection annoys you, remember, it exists because someone centuries ago watched their world turn to ash and said, never again. Or at least, not this badly. Medieval hospitals were not places you went to get better. They were places you went so that everyone else wouldn't get worse. In these stone halls, healing was strictly optional, containment was the true goal. When plagues and epidemics swept through the narrow streets, officials faced a familiar, terrifying problem. Sick people were everywhere, and healthy people were becoming sick simply by standing too close to them. No one understood the concept of germs, but everyone understood the brutal logic of proximity: being near the sick was death. Being far away felt like safety. So, medieval cities invented a solution that was less a medical breakthrough and more a strategic relocation. Hospitals were created as holding areas, grim waystations to put the ill, the injured, the contagious, and sometimes just the inconveniently coughing. These buildings were often constructed outside the city walls, positioned downwind, or tucked into dark corners where no one important had to look at them. This wasn't necessarily cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was triage on a societal scale. Inside these early hospitals, care was basic at best. Patients were fed, prayed over by weary monks, and occasionally treated with remedies that ranged from mildly helpful to actively alarming. But the real function of the hospital wasn't curing disease, it was slowing its spread. If the sick were concentrated in one isolated place, the rest of the city could keep functioning. Markets could stay open. Guards could stay healthy at their posts. Authority could remain intact. People were rightfully terrified of hospitals. Being sent to one felt like a sentence of exile with extra coughing. Families avoided them at all costs until the moment they simply couldn't hide the symptoms anymore. Once inside, patients were largely on their own, tended to by religious orders, brave volunteers, or people with very limited options and incredibly strong stomachs. And yet, despite the grim reality, it worked. Not perfectly, and certainly not kindly, but it worked enough to matter. Cities that established designated care spaces saw fewer uncontrolled outbreaks. The general panic began to ease. Death itself became organized instead of chaotic, which sounds incredibly grim, but in the Middle Ages, organization was the first step toward progress. Over time, something unexpected happened within those walls of exile. Knowledge began to accumulate. Care started to improve. People noticed which practices helped and which ones made things significantly worse. Slowly, and with much trial and error, hospitals shifted from being simple isolation centers into places of actual treatment. Emergency containment evolved into the science of medicine. Modern hospitals are clean, scientific, and designed for recovery. But their ancestor was a medieval decision that went something like, put the sick over there, away from us, preferably behind a high wall. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't compassionate by our modern standards, but it was effective enough to change the course of human history. Hospitals exist today because medieval societies learned that separating illness from daily life was the first necessary step toward surviving it. In a medieval emergency, confusion was often more dangerous than the crisis itself. Whether it was fire, riots, foreign invasions, or outbreaks of plague, all of them shared one fatal weakness: they thrived on the breakdown of truth. When no one knew where the fire was moving or which gate the enemy was approaching, the city would devour itself from the inside out. In the heat of a crisis, nobody knew who to listen to. When everyone is shouting contradictory instructions at once, authority dissolves into nothing more than static noise. Medieval cities discovered this the hard way, usually while something important, like the cathedral or the granary, was actively burning to the ground. In the early days, authority relied almost entirely on reputation. The idea that man is in charge worked perfectly fine in a small village, but it failed utterly the moment you couldn't recognize that man in a crowd of 500 terrified people running in every direction. During chaos, titles meant nothing if they weren't instantly visible. So, medieval societies did something brilliantly simple: they dressed authority differently. Guards began wearing specific, high-contrast colors. Town officials carried distinctive symbols of office, like maces or staffs. Messengers wore recognizable surcoats. Soldiers were marked clearly so that a panicked civilian knew exactly who was allowed to yell orders without being punched in the face. These uniforms weren't about high fashion, they were visual shortcuts for obedience. This was especially critical during emergencies. If a fire broke out, people needed to know instantly who was directing the bucket brigade. If a curfew was being enforced, citizens had to recognize the enforcer without a 10-minute debate. When the plague hit, uniformed officials could deliver quarantine orders without stopping to prove their identity every 5 minutes. Uniforms replaced the need for explanation. And it worked. People followed visible authority more readily. Not because they necessarily trusted the person inside the clothes, but because the alternative, uncertainty, was far worse. A uniform meant someone had been given the social permission to act. In a state of panic, that alone was enough to anchor a crowd. Of course, people resented uniforms immediately. They always have. Uniforms symbolize external control, and humans famously dislike being controlled, right up until the moment things fall apart. Then, suddenly, everyone wants very clear instructions from someone who looks official. Over time, these uniforms became permanent. City guards kept their livery, guild officials adopted formal robes, military clothing became standardized. Authority stopped being personal and became institutional. You didn't obey a person, you obeyed a role. Today, uniforms still do the exact same job. Whether it's police, firefighters, medical staff, or security, their clothing signals authority, responsibility, and a specific expected behavior. We respond automatically. We step aside. We listen. We comply. All of this is because medieval people once realized that during an emergency, asking asterisk, "Who are you?" Asterisk wastes time that no one has. Uniforms didn't make authority wiser, but they made it visible. And in moments of chaos, visibility is often the only thing standing between order and total collapse. Medieval rulers didn't invent rationing because they enjoyed telling their subjects no. They invented it because medieval emergencies had a habit of turning full granaries into empty promises overnight. Wars dragged on longer than expected, winters overstayed their welcome, harvests failed with spectacular, rain-soaked cruelty. And suddenly, every single person in the city wanted the exact same loaf of bread at the exact same time. This never ended well. Initially, cities tried a policy of optimism. They encouraged moderation. They asked people to be reasonable. But medieval history is very clear on how that went. When fear arrived, hoarding arrived with it. The wealthy stockpiled grain behind stone walls, the desperate panicked in the streets. Prices exploded. Fights broke out in town markets over grain that didn't even exist anymore. There was always someone trying to sell a sack of flour that was mostly sawdust and wishful thinking. Faced with this, authorities stepped in with the least popular solution imaginable: total control. Rationing meant strict limits. It meant fixed prices, set quantities, and specific days for distribution. It wasn't gentle, and it certainly wasn't fair in the modern sense of the word, but it prevented total societal collapse. The logic was brutal but effective: if everyone got a little, fewer people starved immediately. If supplies were tracked, the pace of panic slowed. If rules existed, order followed, however grudgingly. Grain was always the most tightly controlled resource because bread shortages caused riots faster than almost anything else. Medieval governments learned very quickly that hungry crowds stop respecting authority the moment their stomachs growl. Consequently, they regulated bakeries, monitored flour supplies, and punished hoarders with terrifying harshness. They didn't do this because they cared deeply about social justice, they did it because bread riots were inconvenient, dangerous, and bad for business. Fuel was rationed, too: wood, peat, charcoal. Anything that kept people warm or allowed them to cook became subject to government oversight during shortages. You could burn fuel, but not excessively. You could buy supplies, but not endlessly. Survival required a forced restraint, whether the people liked it or not. Unsurprisingly, people hated rationing immediately. They complained loudly, they accused officials of favoritism, they claimed the rules were oppressive and badly managed, which, to be fair, they often were. But rationing had one undeniable advantage: it delayed disaster. Once the emergencies ended, these rationing systems often stayed in place because they provided predictability and stabilized volatile markets. Modern rationing during a crisis, food limits, fuel restrictions, supply controls, follows this exact same medieval logic. When resources shrink and fear grows, unregulated freedom collapses faster than regulation ever does. Rationing isn't about control for its own sake. It's about survival math. Medieval societies learned painfully that without limits, emergencies don't just kill supplies, they kill order itself. Medieval cities learned a simple, haunting truth very early on: nothing good happens after dark. In the shadows, fires started more easily and were harder to spot. Crimes became bolder. Arguments escalated faster. When emergencies hit, the cover of nighttime turned mild problems into full-scale disasters with impressive efficiency. Before the invention of the curfew, medieval cities actually tried to trust their citizens. They assumed people would behave responsibly once the sun went down. This assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for the first drunken fight, accidental fire, or panicked stampede to prove otherwise. Darkness reduced visibility, multiplied primal fear, and gave bad decisions a massive confidence boost. So, the cities introduced the curfew. The word itself comes from couvre-feu. Literally, cover the fire. Bells would ring in the evening, city gates would creak shut, and movement simply stopped. If you were caught outside after the bell, you needed a very good reason, and "I felt like a walk" was never accepted. Guards patrolled the silent streets. Anyone wandering without permission was questioned, detained, or encouraged to reconsider their life choices. Curfews weren't about imposing a moral code, they were about containment. When fewer people moved, fewer problems could spread. Fires were easier to spot when the streets were empty. Crime dropped because there were no crowds to hide in. Even disease transmission slowed. Authorities could finally tell who should be outside and who definitely should not. Of course, people hated curfews immediately. Night represented freedom, privacy, and the chance to do things you didn't want witnesses for. Being told to stay indoors felt oppressive, infantilizing, and deeply unfair. Especially to people who were absolutely planning to do something stupid. But the data of the time was clear: curfews worked. Cities with enforced nighttime restrictions experienced fewer fires, fewer riots, and fewer unexplained disasters. The streets grew quieter, and emergency response times improved. Order returned, at least temporarily. And once again, the emergency measure stuck. Over time, curfews became standard tools for managing any crisis: plague, war, or civil unrest. If you shut down movement, chaos follows more slowly. Modern curfews use the same logic, just with better lighting and louder announcements. We still instinctively understand this rule. When something goes wrong, authorities restrict movement. Not because people are inherently evil, but because panic spreads significantly faster in the dark. Less movement equals fewer variables equal more control. Curfews don't stop emergencies, but they slow them down. Medieval societies discovered that slowing chaos, even briefly, could mean the difference between recovery and collapse. So, when you hear a curfew announced today, remember, you're listening to a medieval bell still ringing centuries later, politely reminding humanity that nighttime is a terrible time for decision-making. For a long time, medieval society operated on a bold and deeply optimistic assumption: if someone said they knew how to do something, that was probably good enough. This worked fine for village storytelling or casual farming advice. It worked much less well for medicine, construction, baking, or anything involving sharp tools and structural integrity. During emergencies, this optimism collapsed with horrifying speed. Untrained doctors killed their patients with immense enthusiasm and misplaced confidence. Unqualified builders constructed houses that politely waited for the first snow of winter before collapsing onto the inhabitants. Incompetent bakers produced bread that caused mass illness, riots, or both. During crises, the plagues, the great fires, the famines, the damage caused by incompetence multiplied. When survival depended on actual competence, pretending that everyone was capable became a lethal inconvenience. So, the medieval cities intervened. Guilds were formed, not as cozy professional clubs, but as essential damage control mechanisms. If you wanted to practice a trade, you had to prove you actually knew what you were doing. You trained under a master for years. You followed strict rules. You demonstrated visible skill. If you failed, you were politely, or sometimes violently, told to stop before you harmed anyone else. The age of the amateur was over, the age of the expert had begun. Professional licensing didn't emerge from a desire for excellence, it emerged from a desperate need to reduce casualties. In the medieval world, medical licensing began as a frantic attempt to stop people from experimenting on their neighbors during the height of a plague. Building standards weren't created by architects seeking beauty, they appeared only after far too many emergency shelters collapsed under the weight of their own incompetence. Food regulations followed a trail of repeated poisonings and bread shortages that inevitably ended in street violence. Licensing wasn't an act of protectionism, it was an act of survival. Naturally, people hated it immediately. Unlicensed workers complained that the rules were unfair and exclusionary. Masters guarded the entry to their guilds fiercely. Accusations of favoritism and gatekeeping flew freely through the city squares. And yes, some of these systems became corrupt, restrictive, and deeply frustrating because they were run by flawed humans. But licensing worked just well enough to stay. Cities with regulated trades experienced fewer structural disasters during emergencies. Buildings lasted longer. Food became measurably safer. Medical treatments became slightly less lethal. Once authorities saw these measurable improvements, licensing stopped being a temporary fix and became a permanent pillar of society. Modern professional certification, board exams, building permits, and credentials all descend from this one medieval realization: letting untrained people practice critical skills during a crisis is a bad idea. A very, very bad idea. We now take these licenses for granted. We expect our doctors to be trained, our engineers to be certified, and our food producers to follow rigorous rules. But those expectations only exist because medieval societies learned painfully that, trust me, I know what I'm doing, is not a safety standard. Professional licensing didn't create expertise out of thin air, but it limited the scale of human disaster. And sometimes, that's the best improvement civilization can manage. Medieval cities were not planned, they happened. People built where they could, added structures wherever a patch of space appeared, and stacked lives on top of lives until the result looked less like a city and more like a massive architectural accident. This worked fine in peaceful times, but during an emergency, it was a waking nightmare. When fires broke out, the narrow, winding streets acted like wind tunnels. Flames leapt effortlessly from timber house to timber house, racing through the city faster than any human could run. When disease spread, these cramped, sunless neighborhoods passed illness along like a piece of juicy gossip. When armies approached, the chaotic layouts made defense confusing and a strategic retreat impossible. Walls alone were no longer enough to save the people. After repeated disasters, medieval authorities noticed something uncomfortable. The city itself was part of the problem. Consequently, emergency fixes began to reshape the urban landscape. Streets were widened so that fires had fewer places to jump. Open spaces, or squares, were created not for beauty, but to act as fire breaks and emergency gathering points. Certain trades were pushed away from residential areas, not because of zoning aesthetics, but because tanners, butchers, and dye makers had a habit of making emergencies much more flammable or toxic. This was urban planning born entirely from regret. New towns were designed differently from the ground up, grids replaced winding alleys, markets were centralized, wells were placed strategically in every quarter. Movement was controlled not for the sake of beauty, but for the sake of manageability. A city that could be navigated easily could be defended, cleaned, and controlled during a crisis. People resisted, of course. Wider streets meant less building space for profitable shops. Relocation meant massive expense. Regulations felt like an intrusive hand in the private lives of the citizens. Medieval people complained that these planners were ruining the unique character of their neighborhoods, which is strangely comforting. It proves that humans have complained about urban planning consistently for centuries. But the results were undeniable: fires spread more slowly, disease transmission decreased, and cities recovered faster from the brink. Modern urban design. Fire breaks, zoning laws, public squares, and traffic flow, all descend from the realization that chaotic cities collapse faster under pressure. We now dress these ideas in the language of efficiency and livability, but their origin is far darker. Urban planning didn't make cities pleasant, it made them survivable. For a long time, medieval law existed in a wonderfully flexible state known as, whatever the loudest person remembers. Rules were passed down orally, enforced inconsistently, and argued endlessly in the mud of the marketplace. This worked fine until an emergency arrived and everyone started shouting at once. At that point, memory failed, tempers rose, and justice became a matter of whoever had the strongest voice or the biggest weapon. During the great crises, the plagues, the riots, the famines, verbal law collapsed almost immediately. People argued over obligations, exemptions, and punishments while the city burned. Officials contradicted each other. Witnesses remembered events differently depending on their stress, fear, or personal advantage. Courts turned into theaters of pure confusion where facts drowned under the weight of panic. So, medieval authorities reached a surprisingly modern conclusion: write it down. Written laws didn't appear because rulers suddenly became lovers of clarity or philosophers of justice. They appeared because ambiguity was dangerous. If no one could agree on the rules during an emergency, order vanished instantly. Written laws reduced the debate. They didn't eliminate injustice, but they shortened the arguments. And in a crisis, time mattered far more than fairness. Laws were carved into stone, painted onto walls, and copied into heavy books posted in public places. Not everyone could read, but enough people could recognize the symbols, the seals, and the official formats to know that something serious was being declared. Written law shifted authority away from the fallibility of memory and toward the permanence of the page. Of course, people hated this shift. Written laws removed the flexibility that favored the well-connected. You could no longer argue, "That's not how I remember the agreement." Officials could simply point to the text and say, "It's right there." The law became colder, more rigid, and much harder to negotiate with, which was exactly the point. During emergencies, written laws allowed the city to function, curfews were enforced consistently, punishments were standardized, and responsibilities were clarified. Even when people disagreed with the rules, they at least knew exactly what they were breaking. Modern legal systems still rely on this medieval realization: memory is unreliable under stress, but writing survives the panic. Courts, contracts, regulations, and constitutions all descend from the medieval lesson that yelling rules at frightened people does not create order. Written law didn't make medieval justice fair, but it made it predictable. And in an emergency, predictability often matters more than perfection. Medieval people didn't need philosophy to understand scarcity, they just needed a few brutal winters. A few seasons of frost were enough to teach even the most optimistic town council that hope was not a valid food group. In the early Middle Ages, communities lived dangerously close to the edge. Grain came in once a year, and fuel was strictly seasonal. If something went wrong, a war, a crop blight, a disease, there was no backup plan. People simply ran out of food and then they ran out of time. This happened often enough that eventually, someone had the uncomfortable, revolutionary thought: what if we didn't eat everything immediately? Thus, the emergency stockpile was born. Granaries were built to store grain far beyond the immediate need. Armories stored weapons so they didn't have to be forged during a panic. Fuel reserves were set aside for the dark months of a potential siege. These stockpiles weren't signs of prosperity, they were the visible scars of previous disasters. Every full granary represented a famine that someone remembered all too clearly. Stockpiling was deeply controversial. Grain locked away behind stone walls felt like a cruel injustice when mouths were hungry now. Rulers were accused of hoarding, and corruption was a constant companion to the storehouse. But when the next emergency hit, the stockpiles were the only thing that mattered. Cities with reserves lasted longer, sieges failed, winters became survivable instead of fatal. The presence of stored resources also changed human behavior. Knowing that supplies existed reduced the urge to hoard at home, which in turn reduced the violence in the streets. Over time, these temporary survival measures evolved into permanent infrastructure. Modern emergency reserves of food, fuel, and medical supplies follow this exact same medieval logic: store now so we don't panic later. They exist because we learned the hard way that winter always arrives, and planning ahead beats improvising while starving. Before public warning systems, medieval emergencies had a charming habit of arriving completely unannounced. By the time the danger was obvious, it was usually too late to act. Medieval communities realized that surprise was their worst enemy, so they built noise. Church bells became the primary emergency broadcast system of the age. Bells rang for fires, invasions, and riots. Different rhythms meant different threats, though in practice, most people simply heard the bell and assumed something terrible was happening, which was usually correct. Bells had one massive advantage: they didn't care who you were. Rich or poor, awake or asleep, if the bell rang, you heard it. Sound traveled significantly faster than authority. Flags, hilltop beacon fires, and coordinated horn blasts followed. Medieval cities built entire communication networks designed to scream, "Something is wrong," as loudly as possible. People learned to react instinctively: bell equals action. Drop what you're doing. Look around. Follow the plan. Panic later. Modern sirens, emergency alerts on our phones, and broadcast interruptions are the direct descendants of those medieval bell towers. The technology has changed, but the human psychology remains the same. Loud, unmistakable warnings override our hesitation faster than a polite announcement ever could. Public warning systems weren't designed to inform us, they were designed to interrupt us. Medieval societies learned that in a crisis, interruption saves more lives than explanation. Medieval rulers did not wake up one morning with a sudden, academic passion for taxation. They woke up to the sound of invading armies, collapsing defenses, and empty treasuries. They realized that banners, soldiers, and walls all cost money immediately, and unfortunately, enthusiasm does not pay a mercenary's salary. In calm times, taxes were predictable and familiar. But in an emergency, the usual income streams evaporated. Trade slowed to a crawl, and the harvest failed. Just when the ruler needed money the most, the money disappeared. So, medieval governments invented the emergency taxation. These were special levies announced for wars, ransoms, and urgent situations that somehow never seemed to stop happening. Taxes were raised temporarily, at least in theory. Everyone was told it was only until the crisis passed. Everyone nodded skeptically. And as we know from history, once a government finds a way to collect money during a crisis, they rarely find a reason to stop once the sun comes out. Emergency taxes were never designed to be fair, they were designed to be fast. In a crisis, medieval governments didn't need a committee or a careful debate, they needed gold, and they needed it now. Collection wasn't a request. It was an aggressive, state-mandated harvest. Resistance was punished with a severity that made the tax itself seem like a mercy. People complained, of course, loudly and often, but the authorities allowed the grumbling as long as the coins were paid first. And here is the uncomfortable truth: it worked. Because of these frantic levies, armies were funded just in time to stop an invasion. City walls were repaired before the siege engines arrived. Essential supplies were purchased to keep a starving populace from rioting. Emergency taxation turned blind panic into organized action, albeit at the heavy cost of public goodwill, a trade medieval rulers considered a bargain. However, once the emergency ended, the tax rarely disappeared. Officials noticed something seductive: the system functioned. The collection networks were already built, the records were already kept, and the revenue was flowing smoothly. Why dismantle a machine that works? Thus, temporary measures became permanent pillars of the state. These medieval precedents taught governments that extraordinary circumstances could justify extraordinary funding, and that emergencies could be defined very flexibly. Every special levy, crisis budget, and temporary surcharge in our modern world is a direct descendant of that moment when a medieval ruler realized that survival requires cash, and hesitation costs lives. In ancient Rome, purple was not a fashion choice. It was authority made visible. While today a purple garment might suggest a creative or eccentric personality, to a Roman, it screamed power, immense wealth, and a dangerous proximity to the throne. True purple dye did not come from a plant or a simple recipe. It came from the glands of the murex sea snail. Thousands of these snails had to be harvested, crushed, fermented, and boiled in a process so foul that the stench alone could knock a man unconscious. The result was Tyrian purple, a deep, luminous shade that didn't fade with time. Instead, it grew richer with age, much like a dynasty that refused to die. Because of this, purple became less of a color and more of a legal instrument. Roman law dictated precisely who could wear it. Senators were permitted a broad purple stripe, the latus clavis, running down their tunics. The knightly class, the equites, had to settle for a thinner version, the angustus clavis. Everyone else was expected to admire the color from a respectful distance. Wearing a full purple garment without imperial permission was not a bold statement, it was suicidal. This was not a symbolic law. If you looked like an emperor, you were treated as a rival, and rivals in Rome did not live long. Power in Rome was never subtle, it demanded witnesses. Clothing was the ultimate shortcut for social sorting. You didn't need to ask a man his rank, you simply looked at his tunic. One stripe, two stripes, or none at all, purple did the talking, and it spoke with a roar. Silk entered Rome quietly and immediately made everyone in the Senate deeply uncomfortable. It arrived from the east along the dangerous Silk Road, passing through cultures the Romans half despised. By the time it reached the markets, it was staggeringly expensive, feather-light, and, most problematically, shockingly revealing. To Roman moralists, silk wasn't just fabric, it was a form of physical corruption. Traditional Roman wool was heavy, structured, and modest. It concealed the form and projected gravitas. Silk, however, clung and shimmered, moving with the body in ways associated with foreign decadence and moral decay. When a man wore silk, critics claimed you could see right through his decency. Several sumptuary laws attempted to ban it entirely, especially for men, as it was seen as an abandonment of the masculine ideal of self-control. Seneca famously mocked silk as clothing that does not hide the body or even one's shame. Yet, the elite loved it precisely because it broke the rules. Silk whispered of global reach and the ability to ignore tradition without consequence. It became a test not of taste, but of nerve. If you wore it, you announced that you could afford the fabric, the criticism, and the fallout. The Roman toga was not comfortable. It was a massive, awkward, 6-yard length of wool that required careful folding and at least one hand to hold it in place at all times. It was cold in winter and stifling in summer. And yet, for a male citizen, it was compulsory. The toga was not clothing, it was citizenship made wearable. Only Roman citizens could wear it, foreigners, slaves, and freedmen were strictly excluded. It sorted society at a glance. Public life, courts, assemblies, and religious rites, demanded the toga. Different versions told different stories. Toga virilis, the plain white toga of the adult male. Toga praetexta. Trimmed with purple for boys and magistrates. Toga candida, bleached to a blinding white by candidates for office, the origin of our word, candidate. Roman elites practiced wearing the toga like a high-level skill because it was one. You had to move and gesture in a way that respected the heavy folds. Rome expected you to suffer for your status. You wore it because your ancestors had, and because stepping out of the toga meant stepping out of the social order itself. In Rome, footwear was not an afterthought, it was a declaration. Before a Roman ever spoke, his shoes had already announced his job, his status, and how seriously he should be taken. Citizens wore closed shoes, slaves went barefoot. This distinction was vital. A barefoot man in the city was immediately read as enslaved or disgraced. Senators wore distinctive black leather shoes with crescent-shaped ornaments. Remove the crescent, and the authority vanished. Soldiers wore the caligae, the heavy hobnailed boots that gave the emperor, Caligula, little boot. His nickname. Indoor rules were just as strict. Romans did not track street filth into private homes, shoes were removed and cleaned by slaves. Manners were enforced through leather. Even punishment was expressed through footwear. Criminals might be forbidden from wearing shoes, forcing them into the ultimate public humiliation of being barefoot and vulnerable. Look down at a man's feet in Rome, and the truth was there. What a woman wore in Rome was treated as a public surveillance report on her character. Roman society believed virtue should be readable at a glance. The most important garment was the stola, a long, draped dress reserved exclusively for respectable married women. Wearing it signaled that a woman was legally married and under the protection of the law. It was a badge of honor, but also a leash. It demanded modest behavior and absolute compliance with social boundaries. Conversely, prostitutes were explicitly forbidden from wearing the stola. Instead, they were often forced to wear the toga, a garment otherwise reserved for men. This was a deliberate legal insult, stripping them of feminine respectability. Adulteresses faced a similar fate. A woman convicted of the crime could be barred from the stola forever. Every time she stepped outside, her clothing announced her disgrace to the entire city. Reputation in Rome was preventative justice. At the same time, elite women constantly pushed these boundaries with elaborate hairstyles and heavy jewelry. The rules were rigid, but as always in Rome, morality was remarkably flexible for those who had the gold to pay for the luxury of breaking them. In ancient Rome, hair was never just hair. It was a high-stakes social signal, a loud political statement, and occasionally, a legitimate legal issue. The way you wore your hair, or whether you had any at all, quietly announced your age, gender, moral standing, and loyalty to Roman values. For men, facial hair was especially loaded. Early Roman tradition favored clean-shaven faces as a sign of civilization. Beards were for Greek philosophers, foreign barbarians, or people in deep mourning. A Roman man who suddenly grew a beard without a clear explanation invited immediate suspicion. Was he grieving? Was he rejecting Roman norms? Or worse, was he trying to look like a philosopher without actually doing the thinking? Barbershops were the public spaces of control. A man's first shave was a vital ceremony marking his transition into adulthood and citizenship. The cut hair was often dedicated to a god, reinforcing the idea that grooming was a civic duty. Sloppy hair suggested a sloppy citizen. Women's hair was monitored even more tightly. Modest, structured styles were synonymous with virtue and marital respectability. Married women were expected to carefully arrange their hair in public. Loose or overly elaborate styling could imply sexual availability or moral ambition, depending on who was judging. Roman writers spent an alarming amount of time criticizing women's hairstyles as a proxy for criticizing women themselves. Hair also served as a tool for humiliation. Criminals and the disgraced could have their heads forcibly shaved. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about visibility. A shaved head made a person instantly recognizable as powerless, their loss of hair representing a total loss of dignity. In Rome, jewelry was both a privilege and a provocation. Gold, gems, and pearls were admired, but they were also deeply suspicious. Romans believed visible wealth should be measured and kept within strict socially acceptable limits. Too little suggested poverty, while too much suggested a foreign, decadent weakness. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate exactly how many rings or bracelets a person could wear. For a long time, only senators and the knightly equestrian class were permitted to wear gold rings. To everyone else, the law offered only iron. The ring was not decoration, it was legal identification. Pearls, however, caused the most intense moral panic. Pliny the Elder complained that pearls had become a burden to the ears, a comment fueled by a fear that pearls blurred the lines of hierarchy. Men were expected to be restrained. A man dripping in jewelry was mocked as effeminate. In Rome, losing control of your appearance meant you had lost control of yourself, an unforgivable failure. Punishment often took the form of confiscating rings. Losing the right to wear your gold was a public stripping of your very identity. Grief in Rome was not a private emotion, it was a public performance with a rigid visual script. Mourning clothing ensured that loss was legible and socially controlled. Sorrow had to respect tradition. The standard mourning garment was dark, plain, undyed wool. Bright colors and decorative fabrics were banned. Men in mourning might intentionally neglect their grooming, letting their beards grow as a sign of emotional disruption. But this had a shelf life. Grief that lasted too long was seen as suspicious or manipulative. Women faced even harsher timelines. Widows wore mourning garments for years, their clothing signaling a total withdrawal from public life. Ironically, this sorrow code could be used as a political weapon. Politicians would sometimes dress in mourning to signal protest or moral outrage, suggesting that the state itself had suffered a loss. Rome acknowledged pain, but only within approved boundaries. Clothing kept sorrow polite, temporary, and most importantly, orderly. In ancient Rome, clothing didn't just reflect your status, it could actively condemn you. One of the most striking punishments was forced clothing. Criminals and traitors were compelled to wear humiliating garments to advertise their crimes. Rome believed shame was more effective when it was visible from across a crowded square. Exile came with a devastating wardrobe consequence. A banished Roman lost the right to wear the toga. Without it, he visually ceased to exist. Enslavement, too, was a process of erasing identity through fabric. Slaves wore simple, coarse tunics and were denied distinctive footwear or hairstyles. Looking free without permission was itself a criminal act of impersonation. Even voluntary clothing could be incriminatory. Dressing above your class was seen as sedition, while dressing below it was a form of protest. Rome turned fabric into law because it reduced complexity. You didn't need to investigate a motive when the outfit already told the story. In many ancient societies, tattoos were not a form of self-expression, they were the body's permanent archive. Before paper documents or seals, tattoos served as undeniable proof of identity, a language written on the skin that could not be forged or forgotten. While clothing could be removed and jewelry stolen, a tattoo remained. In these cultures, being tattooed was often a restricted privilege. It was reserved for elites, warriors, or priests who had completed specific rites. The process was intentionally slow and painful, involving blood and ritual tools. Suffering was the price of legitimacy. These weren't random designs, they were coded systems. A mark on the forehead meant something entirely different than a mark on the hand. However, the same technology could exclude. In some societies, criminals or enslaved people were forcibly tattooed to mark their disgrace. This dual nature made tattoos socially dangerous. A mark could grant authority or strip it away forever. In a world without records, your body told your story whether you wanted it to or not. Among the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe, tattoos were elite insignia. Archaeology has uncovered frozen bodies in the Altai Mountains with tattoos that were deliberate, complex, and unmistakably royal. These tattoos depicted animals in constant, swirling motion, stags with twisted antlers, predatory cats mid-leap, and birds of prey. These weren't just pretty pictures, they symbolized the qualities the Scythian elite claimed for themselves: speed, dominance, vigilance, and ferocity. Placement was key. Tattoos appeared on the shoulders, arms, and legs, the areas of the body associated with the strength and mobility required for a nomadic warrior culture. Faces were rarely marked, suggesting a level of restraint and hierarchy. Not everyone was entitled to carry the full visual language of power. To be a Scythian noble was to be a living, breathing map of your people's mythology, written in ink that lasted even after the flesh had frozen in time. In the ancient world, power was not always built from stone. For the Scythians, the nomadic masters of the Eurasian steppe, authority was carried in the flesh. The most elaborate tattoos discovered by archaeologists appear on individuals buried with golden ornaments, heavy weaponry, and sacrificed horses, the clear markers of leadership. Scythian tattoos functioned as visual biographies. Long before a warrior ever spoke, his body told a story of achievements, lineage, and spiritual affiliation. In a culture where communities were constantly on the move and written records were impractical, identity needed to travel with the person. Tattoos solved this problem with brutal elegance. Pain was the gatekeeper of this status. Using primitive bone or metal needles and natural pigments, the tattooing process was slow and agonizing. But endurance was the point. A tattoo that hurt proved the bearer was worthy of the power it represented. Weakness could not hide behind ink. Tellingly, ordinary individuals and captives show no evidence of such complex markings. To the ancient Scythian, an unmarked body wasn't pure, it was insignificant. On the steppe, ink replaced architecture, your skin was your palace, and your history was your crown. In Polynesian societies, tattoos were not symbols you chose, they were inheritances you carried. The word itself comes from the Polynesian, tata, meaning, to strike. A constant reminder that these marks were earned through ritual, not whim. Tattoos mapped lineage. Every line and curve corresponded to family history and social rank. Chiefs wore the most complex designs because their genealogy was the most extensive. To look at a heavily tattooed chief was to see generations of authority rendered visible. Placement was rigidly structured, the thighs and hips often bore designs of strength, while facial tattoos marked noble status and spiritual weight. Wearing the wrong pattern in the wrong place wasn't just an insult, it was sacrilege. Tattooing was overseen by priests who held immense religious authority. A single wrong line could misrepresent an entire ancestry or offend the spirits. Because the stakes were so high, the process was slow and ceremonial. Tools made of bone or shell were tapped rhythmically into the skin. Refusal to endure this meant social exile. An adult man without tattoos was viewed as unfinished or untrustworthy. In Polynesia, your ancestry wasn't hidden in a scroll. It was worn openly as proof of your belonging. In ancient Egypt, tattoos carried a meaning entirely different from the warrior elites of the north. Here, ink was closely tied to protection, fertility, and divine alignment. Notably, it was a language spoken almost exclusively by women. Archaeological evidence from Middle Kingdom mummies shows dots, lines, and diamond shapes tattooed across the abdomen, thighs, and breasts. These weren't ornamental, they were permanent amulets. Egyptian childbirth was lethal, and these tattoos sat precisely where the danger was greatest. They invoked protective deities like Bes and Tauret, symbolically armoring the woman against chaos. The tattooed woman in Egypt was not a social rebel, she was consecrated. These marks are concentrated among priestesses and women of elite households. Some scholars even argue the patterns of dots were designed to move and shift during pregnancy, visually interacting with the expanding body to provide psychological and spiritual support. In Egypt, tattoos weren't statements of rank, they were safeguards for the threshold between life and death. For the Greeks and Romans, the view of ink was sharply different. Tattoos were not marks of prestige, they were marks of control. To a Greek citizen, a tattooed body looked barbarian and undisciplined. The ideal Greek body was smooth and unmarked, a reflection of rational order. Consequently, tattoos became tools of humiliation. They were used to label criminals, prisoners of war, and enslaved people. The body became a living administrative document, stating who owned you or what crime you had committed. Rome inherited this logic, tattooing gladiators and those condemned to hard labor, often on the forehead so that shame followed them everywhere. Even Roman soldiers were sometimes tattooed on the hand for identification, ensuring loyalty and preventing desertion. The message was clear, your body belongs to the state. While other cultures used ink to elevate identity, Rome used it to flatten it. In the classical world, if you were marked, someone else was in control. To the Celtic and Pictish peoples, tattoos were confrontational. Roman writers described these northern warriors as painted or stained, finding them deeply unsettling on the battlefield. To the Romans, the marks were chaotic; to the Celts, they were declarations of dominance. These swirling patterns and animal motifs transformed the body into a visible extension of the tribe. The most elaborate markings were reserved for those who had proven themselves in combat. A tattooed warrior announced his experience before he ever lifted a sword. These designs often mirrored the patterns found in Celtic metalwork and sacred stone carvings, creating a continuity between the person, their tribe, and the very land they defended. To Rome, this bodily autonomy was a threat. A territory that could not be easily conquered. Long before tattoos became associated with the underworld in Japan, they were marks of bravery and regional identity. Coastal and river communities used them as spiritual safeguards. Fishermen tattooed themselves to ward off sea spirits in environments where death was common. In a culture that valued composure, submitting to the agonizing pain of a tattoo was proof of character. However, as centralized authority grew, the state redirected this power. Tattoos were used to mark criminals on the face, turning a symbol of courage into a badge of disgrace. This dual history explains Japan's complicated relationship with the art. Whether honorable or shameful, a tattoo was always serious. It was a memory that could not be erased, eventually shifting from a chosen mark of strength to an imposed mark of the outsider. Among the indigenous cultures of the Americas, tattoos were records of action. You were not tattooed for who you were, but for what you had done. These marks documented success in war, endurance in ritual, and fulfillment of social duties. The body was a living ledger. For a warrior, lines on the face or chest signified enemies defeated or wounds survived. For a woman, they might mark a transition into motherhood or a specific ritual role. Tattooing often culminated a vision quest or a rite of passage. The pain was intentional, demonstrating a readiness for new responsibility. European colonizers often mistook these for primitive decoration, but in reality, they functioned as medals, licenses, and certificates combined. In these cultures, the skin carried an honest history. You had either lived the achievement, or you hadn't. And Boleyn was not raised to be a queen, but she was trained to move comfortably among the gears of power. Her early life was a political laboratory. Sent by her ambitious father to the Low Countries and then to the French court, and was shaped by exposure to the most refined and dangerous environments in Europe. In France, she served the Queen and absorbed Renaissance ideals and early reformist theology. This was no finishing school. It was where she learned that charm was leverage and wit was a weapon. She learned how monarchs spoke and how reputations could be dismantled with a single glance. By the time she returned to England, she possessed a sophisticated restraint and an intellectual curiosity that made her a foreign anomaly in the Tudor court. She had learned the ultimate lesson: charm wasn't softness, it was the most effective way to wield influence in a world ruled by men. Silence could provoke interest. Attention could be rationed. And Boleyn returned to the English court not as a naive, wide-eyed courtier, but as someone visibly, palpably different. She moved with a continental grace that felt foreign, dressed in French fashions that dared the eyes to linger, and carried herself with a self-assurance that unsettled the stagnant air of the Tudor court. She was not universally admired. In fact, many found her sharp tongue and dark, intelligent eyes deeply unsettling. But she was noticed. And in the world of the Tudors, being noticed was the first essential step toward influence. Crucially, and understood a truth many overlooked. Power did not solely reside with the king. It flowed through access, through the subtext of conversation, and through the brutal precision of timing. She had spent her youth watching queens, favorites, and mistresses rise to heights and fall to ruins. She knew that proximity to a monarch could elevate a family to glory or erase its name overnight. And did not arrive at court dreaming of a crown, she arrived equipped to survive proximity to it. That distinction matters immensely. Because when the king finally turned his predatory attention toward her, she was not unprepared. She had been trained for this lethal environment long before England even realized what kind of woman had crossed the channel. She was not born to rule, but she was trained to endure, and that made her the most dangerous woman in the room. When Boleyn re-entered the English ecosystem, she found it functioning on a routine of predictable intimacy. Kings took mistresses. Women gained favor through the bedroom. It wasn't a scandal, it was a career path. What made an extraordinary was her total refusal to play the assigned role. Henry VIII noticed her in the mid-1520s, while he was already involved with her sister, Mary Boleyn. Mary had been his mistress, quietly used and then just as quietly discarded. And saw that pattern and recognized its terminal end, short-term favor followed by long-term ruin. She chose a path of unprecedented risk. She did not reject the king. That would have been a death sentence for her family's ambitions. Instead, she controlled the access. She flirted and then withdrew, she engaged his mind while refusing his bed. This was a radical shift in the balance of power. At the Tudor court, kings were pursued, they were never denied. Anne's resistance turned a royal whim into a feverish obsession. Henry was used to obedience, but on offered conditions. She insisted that her honor was not for sale and that she would not surrender without the bond of marriage. Whether this was genuine piety or cold political calculation remains one of history's great debates, but the effect was undeniable. The king was no longer the sole decision-maker, he was reacting to her. Court factions watched in a mix of horror and opportunism. And had forced the King of England to imagine a future that did not include his wife, Catherine of Aragon. In doing so, she didn't just protect her reputation, she set the gears of a revolution in motion. Anne's refusal placed Henry in a theological and political vice. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, a queen of impeccable lineage and a woman respected across the continent. To marry Anne legally, Henry didn't just need a divorce, he needed a papal annulment. What followed was not a private marital spat, it was a constitutional crisis that would tear England from the roots of the Catholic Church. For years, Henry pursued Rome for a solution, arguing that his marriage was cursed because Catherine had been his brother's widow. But the surface-level theology masked a deeper dynastic desperation. Catherine had failed to produce a male heir, and represented the hope of a son. However, the Pope was effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. Rome would not bend, and waited in a terrifying limbo. Each passing year increased the risk. She was aging in a court that devoured women once they lost their bloom. During this period, her influence surged. She surrounded herself with reformist thinkers who argued that a king answered only to God, not to a pope in Rome. These ideas gave Henry his exit strategy. If Rome wouldn't change the rules, Henry would change the world. With the support of Parliament, he severed England's obedience to the papacy. The English Church was born from the intersection of frustration, desire, and cold-blooded politics. In secret, Henry married Anne. Soon after, she was crowned queen. A former lady-in-waiting now wore the crown of a redefined kingdom, but the cost was the spiritual division of a nation. Anne had achieved the impossible, but she was standing on ground that had been broken to accommodate her. And Boleyn's coronation did not bring the security she craved. It brought a microscopic level of scrutiny. From the moment the crown touched her head, her worth to the kingdom narrowed to a single, biological expectation: she had to produce a son. England held its breath. And became pregnant quickly, but when the child arrived, it was a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment at court was immediate, sharp, and dangerous. A daughter did not stabilize a dynasty, it merely postponed the crisis. Anne insisted Elizabeth would rule gloriously, but she knew that in the eyes of the king, confidence was no substitute for a male heir. Her subsequent pregnancies ended in tragedy. Miscarriages followed, including the devastating loss of a male fetus. At court, sympathy was a rare commodity, it was quickly replaced by calculation. If Anne couldn't deliver the son Henry had broken the world for, perhaps she could be replaced just as easily as Catherine had been. Henry's obsession began to sour into impatience. He had bent the church for Anne, and now he demanded a return on his investment. Anne, never one to submit quietly, was criticized for her temper and her sharp wit, traits that had once charmed the king now only served to irritate him. Enemies multiplied. A new woman appeared at court, Jane Seymour, younger, quieter, and carefully designed to be the opposite of the sharp Anne. The rules had narrowed to a lethal point: produce a son or be removed. And Boleyn did not fall because of a mistake, she fell because her existence had become a political inconvenience. By the spring of 1536, the climate had shifted. She was no longer the symbol of hope, she was a liability. The turning point was her final miscarriage. It freed Henry psychologically. The marriage had failed its only indispensable task, and his attention shifted with chilling speed to Jane Seymour. What followed was not an emotional breakup, but a meticulously planned legal assassination. The charges were constructed with a cold, administrative efficiency. Adultery, incest with her brother, and treason. These weren't plausible crimes, and was far too intelligent to risk her position for a fling, but they were useful crimes. Adultery justified a divorce, treason ensured an execution and the total erasure of her influence. The men accused with her were courtiers with no means of defense. Evidence was non-existent, timelines were manipulated, confessions were implied or forced. Anne was no longer a partner or a queen. She was a problem to be solved by the headsman's sword. The woman who had reshaped the English church and the English throne was being dismantled by the very power she had helped Henry seize. Tudor justice was never interested in proof. It was interested in an outcome. The moment Anne Boleyn was arrested and rode beneath Traitor's Gate to the Tower of London, her story was already over. From that second, the end was not just inevitable, it was a foregone conclusion. The trials that followed were not investigations, they were staged performances. The verdicts were predetermined, the witnesses were coached, and the woman who had once controlled access to the king now found herself in a vacuum of absolute silence. What makes Anne's fall so deeply disturbing is its chilling speed. One day she was the most powerful woman in the kingdom, the Queen of England. Within weeks, she was a condemned prisoner. This was not a moment of chaotic passion, it was a piece of deliberate, state-sponsored choreography. Every step was designed to remove her cleanly, professionally, and permanently. And understood this with a terrifying clarity. Her reported composure during her imprisonment was not a sign of denial. It was the calm of a woman who finally saw the machinery for what it was. She knew that the system she had helped Henry reshape, the system of royal supremacy and absolute power, was now being turned against her. Her rise had changed England, but her fall served a different purpose. It reminded every noble in the court that in Tudor England, proximity to the king was not a shield. It was exposure. And Boleyn was no longer a partner, she was an obstacle. And in Henry's world, being unnecessary was a death sentence. Anne's trial was not a search for truth. It was a formal ceremony to solve a political problem. By the time she stood before her judges, the accusations had been inflated to a monstrous scale. Adultery, incest with her brother George, and a conspiracy to kill the king. These charges were chosen with surgical precision. Ordinary adultery might have allowed for a quiet banishment or life in a convent, but treason required the sword. The goal was not to correct her behavior, it was to erase her identity. The evidence presented was, by any logical standard, absurd. Dates did not align. Witnesses placed Anne in locations she couldn't have reached. Some of the alleged encounters were said to have occurred in public, high-traffic spaces where she was under constant supervision. But Tudor courts didn't care about coherence, they cared about compliance. Anne defended herself with a fierce, desperate intelligence. Accounts from the day describe her as articulate and controlled, even as she faced the incredulous nature of the lies. She denied every charge and challenged every inconsistency. She reminded the court of her status and her years of service. It was all in vain. The judges were nobles whose entire futures, their lands, their titles, their lives, depended on the king's satisfaction. Justice wasn't blind in 1536, it was obedient. The inclusion of the incest charge served a specific, dark purpose, it ensured her total moral destruction. She wasn't just a disloyal wife, she was painted as a monster. This narrative justified not just her death, but the total rewriting of her legacy. The men judging her had dined at her table. They had ridden her coattails to power. Now, they watched her be dismantled without a single word of protest. Survival in the Tudor court demanded a very specific kind of silence. And was found guilty on all counts. Even Henry's mercy was part of the performance. He granted her a French swordsman for a faster, cleaner death, a final, controlled act of cruelty. The trial stripped Anne of her title, her marriage, and her humanity. It proved that the Tudor state didn't need truth, it needed closure. And Boleyn's final days were marked by a silence that unsettled everyone around her. Within the tower, she moved through the rituals of the condemned with a poise that made her jailers nervous. She prayed, she made dark, biting jokes about her little neck, and she spoke with absolute clarity about her fate. The execution was a masterpiece of Tudor stagecraft. The skilled swordsman from France was a deliberate choice, it signaled refinement to a European audience. An axe was the tool of a butcher, a sword was the tool of a knight. And dressed with painstaking care, removed her headdress, and addressed the small crowd with a dignity that refused to give the king the satisfaction of a breakdown. She followed the script. She did not protest her innocence or accuse the king. In the Tudor world, you died as you lived, according to the rules of the court. The blade fell once. Within days, the king was engaged to Jane Seymour. The state tried to move on without pause, but that is the great irony of Anne's death. They could erase her body, but they couldn't undo what she had done. The religious break she justified remained. The monasteries stayed closed. The English church did not return to Rome. But most importantly, her daughter lived. Elizabeth, the girl whose birth had been labeled a failure, would grow up to rule England longer and more effectively than any Tudor monarch. The queen they had dismissed produced the most formidable ruler in English history. Over time, Anne's reputation became a mirror for whoever was looking, a seductress, a martyr, a reformer, or a pawn. But her impact was undeniable. She forced a king to break a world that in the years following the execution, Anne's name became a dangerous whisper. Officially, she was a non-person. Her marriage was annulled, meaning Elizabeth was legally a bastard. Elizabeth grew up in the shadow of the sword, watching her mother's image be methodically scrubbed from the palace walls. She learned the most important lesson and never had the chance to finish: survival through restraint. Elizabeth inherited more than just Anne's dark hair and sharp wit. She inherited her mother's political instinct and a bone-deep understanding of how power punishes women who look like a threat. Unlike Anne, Elizabeth learned to cloak her ambition in a shroud of patience. She watched the chaos of her father's subsequent marriages and saw what visibility cost. Ironically, the very qualities that killed and became Elizabeth's greatest strengths. Anne had been too bold and too direct. Elizabeth learned to delay, to deflect, and to remain intentionally unreadable. Where Anne forced the king's hand, Elizabeth kept everyone waiting. Where Anne demanded legitimacy through a husband, Elizabeth ruled by refusing to ever take one. When she finally ascended the throne, she inherited a kingdom permanently altered by her mother's life. The stability of the Elizabethan era was built on the wreckage of Anne's catastrophe. Anne had tried to secure power through proximity. Elizabeth secured it through distance. And didn't fail to produce a successful heir, she produced the most prepared ruler England could have ever asked for. The daughter succeeded because she didn't just inherit Anne's legacy, she survived it. And Boleyn's greatest influence happened after she was gone. She should have been a footnote, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. Instead, she became a fault line. The English Reformation didn't reverse itself. The break with Rome became the new normal. Even those who hated her were forced to live in the house she had helped build, but Anne also fundamentally changed the definition of a queen. Before her, queens were expected to be fertile, quiet, and obedient vessels for the dynasty. Anne violated every one of those rules. She spoke, she argued, she sponsored radical thinkers, and she put her hands on the levers of policy. Her punishment was meant to warn women to stay in their place, but the precedent was already set. She proved that a queen could be a political actor. The lesson for the future wasn't that women shouldn't participate in power, it was that they had to be smarter than the men who tried to take it away. And Boleyn was the architect of a New England, even if she didn't live to see the roof put on the building. Her story did not merely fade into the archives, it became a warning embedded deeply into the very marrow of Tudor culture. It was a lesson learned in hushed whispers by both men and women alike. Proximity to power was a seductive intoxicant, but it was fundamentally unstable. Favor was a shifting tide that could turn lethal overnight. Anne's life stood as a stark demonstration that intelligence, no matter how sharp, was never enough without structural protection. Ambition, when stripped of the insulation provided by birthright or ironclad alliances, invited nothing but total destruction. Over the centuries, the harsh edges of Anne's reputation began to soften. Protestant writers, seeking to justify the New English Church, cast her as a spiritual martyr. Later historians, peeling back the layers of Tudor propaganda, reassessed the skeletal evidence used to condemn her and found it hollow, a collection of administrative lies. Modern interpretations have moved further still, seeing her not as the classic schemer of the Victorian imagination, but as a brilliant woman navigating a predatory, unforgiving system with a limited and dwindling set of options. All of these readings coexist today because Anne herself resists the comfort of simplicity. What remains undisputed is the sheer scale of the transformation she triggered. England after Anne Boleyn was fundamentally, irreversibly different from the country that existed before her arrival. The monarchy's relationship to religion had been severed and stitched back together in a new, national image. The concept of female political influence had expanded, it had become a tangible force, even as it remained a deadly gamble. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the Tudor dynasty's most successful, most enduring ruler carried not only Anne's blood but her hard-won lessons. And did not live long enough to manage the world she helped create, but in the grand theater of history, few people ever do. History often belongs to the catalysts, those who trigger the seismic shifts, rather than those who survive the aftermath. And Boleyn forced decisions that could never be undone, and she paid the highest price civilization can demand for that audacity. We began this journey by looking at the medieval city, a place where chaotic growth met the brutal necessity of emergency planning. We saw how fires, plagues, and famines forced the hand of civilization, creating the licenses, the zoning, and the laws we now take for granted. And Boleyn's life was its own kind of emergency. Her rise was a fire that jumped the narrow streets of tradition, her refusal to be a mistress was a structural collapse that forced the rebuilding of the English Church. Like the medieval city planners who widened the streets after the flames had already passed, we look back at her story and see the zoning laws of power being written in real time. We see the origin of the modern state. Born not from a desire for perfection, but from the desperate, often violent need to survive a crisis. Every time we look at a professional credential, a street grid, or a written law, we are looking at a scar from a past disaster. And every time we look at the crown of England, we are looking at the legacy of a woman who proved that even when everything goes wrong, the changes we force during the panic become the foundations of the future.